Hello, everyone. I'm Dieter Mason, and today I'm going to talk to you about overcoming Cloud FinOps challenges. But before I get started, a little bit about myself. I have been working 100% in the cloud since 2013 at companies like Google, Netflix, Intuit, and most recently Roku. I'm also one of the FinOps ambassadors, and my contact information is on the screen here. Now, what are the Cloud FinOps challenges? Well, in the State of FinOps survey from 2023, we identified the following Cloud FinOps challenges, and I'm going to talk about all of them to you. That said, you can find the information on data.finops.org, hash 3388. That is the specific survey result that we are referencing today. Now, let's get to how to overcome Cloud FinOps challenges. The first challenge is empowering engineers to take action. Well, what makes it difficult, right? Either the engineers don't know how to take action, they are not motivated, or leadership does not give time to take action, right? And let's look at these things a little bit more in detail because they will keep repeating throughout this presentation, right? So if someone doesn't know, the way to fix that is through training, right? You provide training to them. Either this can be in an informal setting where it's just a tech talk or a brown bag or something like that, right? Or you do a formal training where they get a certification at the end or something along those lines, right? When it comes to taking action, there is also different scenarios, right? There is waste, there's underutilization, there is right sizing, right? This is the scenarios that we are talking about. And to overcome these specific challenges, what you need to do is you need to document each and every single scenario, identify what the process is on how to overcome this, on how to take care of this specific challenge. And then the documentation can be either like a wiki page or Confluence or something like that, right? And then you, if an engineer has a question, hey, I have unused RDS, relational databases, right? What should I do? You can simply share the link to that wiki page or to the Confluence, right? And that helps also because if other engineers have challenges, they can share these links, and it's basically a runbook on how to accomplish this specific task, right? When an engineer or when any person is not motivated, the way to motivate them is partially through training, right? To explain to them why something is a challenge that needs to be addressed, or you go to leadership, right? If their manager says this is something that you need to be working on, that is very powerful, right? And more formal approach is that you make that part of the performance evaluation, right? So objectives and key results is one of the forms, right? And you basically make the cost remediation or usage optimization. You make that part of the engineer's OKRs, right? And a more formal approach is to either dedicate a percentage of each sprint, let's say 20% of the sprint, we're going to dedicate to cost optimization or to usage optimization, or you have specific sprints that look at cost optimization itself, right? Best solution is, and unfortunately it is challenge number 10, on how to get leadership buy-in, leadership support, right? So we are going to talk about that in detail, but it is the 10th highest ranked FinOps challenge. So we'll talk about that at the end, right? But yeah, getting executive support, and then, the executives ask the vice presidents for help, they ask for the directors, and so it trickles down the organizational hierarchy, right? So what's the next challenge? Getting to unit economics, right? What are the typical challenges here? One is what are unit economics? What units, what KPIs should we measure? How to measure them, right? Sometimes some business KPIs are not readily available, and you need to find a way to capture them either manually or better in automated way, right? And then how do you know if what you measured is good enough, right? Should it be improved? How does it compare across the industry? What are the things to watch out for, right? And I will have some specific examples around these KPIs in the next slides where we go over details, right? Something that you can do. Well, to get started here, simply look at vCPU, cost per vCPU hour, and cost per gigabyte stored. Those are two very simple KPIs that you can establish just using your cloud bill and track that over time, right? You can also look at business KPIs, for example, cost per active user or cost per ticket issued or cost per tax return, those kind of things, right? And if you have difficulties defining these business KPIs, you can, as a fallback, also use cost per revenue, right? And in most cases, cloud cost per revenue should be 4.5% or less, right? And these unit economics should also trend down over time, right? And let's look at one example. Here's, for example, the cost per vCPU hour. There's a graph, a very simple graph, where you look at the vCPU cost on a monthly basis. And as you see, it is mostly trending down over time. And that indicates that the engineers are choosing cheaper compute options in the cloud, which is what you want, right? Another example here is the cost per gigabyte stored. Specifically, what the graph shows is the percentage of all blob storage that is in the hottest or most expensive storage option. And so you see that over the years, this goes down as engineers choose cheaper storage options. For example, on AWS, you can, instead of using standard S3, you can enable S3 intelligent tiering. Get started with the largest buckets, and then over time, the objects will age out and will be stored in cheaper storage options, right? And again, my suggestion here is to go and measure the savings over time and share that with leadership, right? To build trust and confidence that this is working. Here's an example of a business KPI. So in this graph, we have 5 years, and the blue boxes represent the total cloud spend. So we see that in the first 3 years, the cloud spend, for the most part, doubled each year, right? The red line shows the cost per 1,000 streaming hours. That is for the Roku example, right? And you see here that that business KPI, right, basically doubled also for each of the first 3 years, right? Then in year 3, we decided that this is not a sustainable way of operating in the cloud, right? We can't just double our cloud spend every year. And so the mandate was made that the cost per 1,000 streaming hours has to be flat or constant, right? Or over time. So any new development has to be funded by a optimization of some sort, right? Now, what is interesting in this graph is that you see that while the cost per streaming hour stays roughly flat from year 3 through year 5, the total cloud spend increases, right? Year over year, but a little bit. It doesn't double, but it increases. And the reason for that is that we have overall our active users are increasing as well. And so the number of streaming hours increases, right? So while we do spend more year over year, right, the cost per 1,000 streaming hour stays flat. And as I mentioned, if you can't establish any business KPIs, then you can, as a fallback, go with cloud cost per revenue, and a good target here is 4.5%. Next one is organizational adoption of cloud FinOps. We have the typical challenges that the people don't know how to contribute in cloud FinOps, and the people are not motivated. There is, no reason for them to interact with cloud FinOps. So to overcome that, the use data to drive decisions, right? Have the cloud cost reporting make the cost visible for each business unit, cost center, or engineering team, right? This will help then show that this business unit is running more efficient than the other one. So you, in a sense, can gamify and help motivate, right? Also define clear roles and responsibilities, right? If a person doesn't know what to do, it is okay to go to them and tell them, hey, at the end of the month, I need you to check your actual spend versus the budget and see if you're over and under, and then decide where to go from there, right? Typically, if you're overspending, that's very easy. You have new features, new experiments, right? If you're underspending, in my experience, it is related to maybe you can't hire fast enough, right? And you have a problem there, right? Again, when it comes to collaboration, it is important to have a business rhythm, right? Where you meet on a regular basis. Now, depending on the level, right? Maybe on a CTO or CFO level, right? You may want to meet once a quarter and share the slide deck in advance so that the executives can do a pre-read, right? And then when it comes to the actual meeting, right, you can have a more specific conversation around the content in the slides, right? The content should not become as a surprise to the executives, right? And then, maybe on a VP or director level, you could do this on a monthly basis. And then when it comes to maybe interacting with the finance professional, you want to do that on a weekly basis, right? So the cadence is dependent on the level, right? Again, measure and communicate, right? Whenever you have such a check-in, use three things. The first thing is what have you accomplished since our last meeting? The second thing is what do you plan to do until our next meeting? And the third thing is there any roadblocks, any showstoppers, right? And any positive outcomes, celebrate them and socialize them across the organization, because that will again provide visibility. It will build trust, right? And it will motivate people to participate, right? Overall, the goal here is to build a culture of cost accountability, right? You can't just put something in the cloud and walk away from it, right? The typical the engineer builds something and then the site reliability engineering takes care of it in production. That doesn't work, right? Engineers can start workloads that are tens of thousands a day, right? And so they have to be accountable for the cost, right? And again, when people don't know how to do something, provide training, right? FinOps training, also, maybe storytelling is a good way of presenting outcomes, and use the STAR schema, right? Start with, that was the situation, that is what we wanted to achieve, and then here are the outcomes, and this is how it benefits the organization. Now, next is reducing waste or unused resources, right? Again, we have the same challenges as before. The engineers don't have visibility. They don't know what to do, how to fix the waste, and leadership doesn't give enough time, right? Here, a very simple first approach, it can be done in a Excel spreadsheet, is to build sort of like a dashboard of waste, right? but tie the waste to the engineering leader, right? So that you have a responsible individual for that, right? And then also calculate the waste numbers correctly, which is, okay, here's the cost of the unoptimized workload. And if we were to optimize the workload, there is a cost reduction. So the waste is the difference between the two, right? And that calculation has to be accurate. It cannot be a ballpark calculation, right? And then you take all that cloud waste and you aggregate it and you bubble it up by a technology leader, right? And that will then sort of gamify also the situation where the responsible individuals or the leaders, right? They will see a ranking, right? Sort that by the largest dollar number on top, right? And then you see, who has the most impact on cloud waste, right? Again, maybe you want to start with a couple of simple categories, right? Something like idle RDS, idle load balancers, something like that, right? And then move your way up. For example, when I started at Intuit, we started with 6 waste sensors, right? And we identified that about slightly over 20% of our cloud spend was actually waste, right? And then over the 4 years, we expanded it from 6 waste sensors. Those are simply scripts that identify waste and aggregate it in a central database where you can then report it out of, right? And then over 4 years, we expanded it from 6 waste sensors to 34 waste sensors. And we were able to push the waste down below 5% over that course, right? Again, if people don't know how to fix waste, use documentation, right? You use wikis, Confluence pages, basically run books on how to handle a certain situation. And maybe even with commands, this is how you find the waste, this is how you turn this thing off, this is how you take a backup, those kind of things, right? And for training, use the same thing, right? Informal training like tech talks, brown bags, or formal training with certifications, right? Again, as in the very first challenge, right, it is ideal that waste becomes part of people's performance reviews, right? And leadership needs to have either a percentage of a sprint or entire sprints dedicated to just waste remediation. Here's an example of a Amazon QuickSight KPI dashboard. And you see here that on the left-hand side, you define goals, right? So sometimes the goal is to have less than 10% of something, and sometimes the goal is to have the majority of your cloud resources in an optimized state. So the very first line in the table on the right says the previous generation of EC2. This means older instances, right? And you can see here that we are having on average 2% of our compute is in older instances, right? Then the third line from the top says EC2 Graviton. Graviton is a cheaper alternative to an Intel x86 microprocessor. And you see here that for the most part, we are 50% of our compute is in that cheaper compute option. And you remember from the graph that I showed before, where we are looking at the cost per vCPU hour, right? And it was trending down. So this is another way of seeing this, right? And there's other things like, for example, the S3 standard is about halfway down the table, is around 40%. That means that only 40% of all of our storage is in that highest cost storage option. Now let's move on. Implementing FinOps governance at scale. There's a couple of challenges here. First is every organization has business units, and that is a good thing. They are basically silos, right? That have their own VP, their own organizational hierarchy, And the idea is that each business unit makes decisions fast within their business unit. So, for example, TurboTax is a business unit within Intuit. QuickBooks is another business unit, right? So you want these business units to be as autonomous as possible to make fast decisions, right? However, when it comes to initiatives that go across the organization, these silos are a problem, right? Another one is to view the cloud or to use the cloud like a data center, right? You don't want to do that. You want to take advantage of the elasticity of the cloud. In a data center, when you procure hardware, it is typically amortized over a 3, 4, or 5-year time period, right? And so the hardware is intentionally procured at a larger scale, and the workloads are expected to grow into the hardware as time progresses, right? And so there's a culture of over provisioning, right? And again, in the cloud, once the organization becomes fairly substantial, the manual processes don't scale, right? You have the run books that you can execute on individually, right? But at some point, the cloud footprint will become so large that you can't use manual processes anymore. You will have to use some type of automation, right? And so again, to overcome that is to initiate a culture shift, right? Where the engineers see cost as another dimension that they need to optimize, right? And as I mentioned, you will need to leverage automation here, either through third-party tools or through in-house tools, right? Because for all intents and purposes, the cloud will get too large for to be able to, for one engineer, use a command line and do improvements there. Again, establish KPIs, provide organizational-wide visibility and track the KPIs over time, celebrate successes, and training and education, as we mentioned before, either informal or formal, and try to make this part of everyone's forefront, bring this to the forefront of everyone's thinking that cost is another dimension that needs to be optimized. Now, accurate forecasting of cloud spend. That's my favorite one, and we have a lot of slides to go over that, right? So what are the typical challenges? Well, one typical challenge is that you may have a large forecast variance. What does this mean? Well, that let's say you forecast 12 months out into the future, or 2 or 3 years, right? Depending on your enterprise agreement, what the renewal is, right? Are you on a 3-year agreement, 5-year agreement, those kind of things, right? And you see that you have a large forecast variance, and we are going to touch on what some good goals are here. Another challenge is that when engineers make changes to existing or new workloads, that these changes are not being communicated, and any type of machine learning that you're using in your forecasting algorithms, it cannot predict things like a new country, a new feature, a new product, right? It has zero chance to predict these types of large swings in cloud usage, right? And that is also the last item here that we have under challenges, right? That there can be very substantial changes in cloud usage, right? For example, an acquisition can all of a sudden bring in a substantial cloud spend, right? That is in the tens of millions of dollars, right? And no forecasting algorithm has the ability to forecast that, right? So there's a couple of things that need to be done to overcome that. One is that you want a self-service way for engineers and engineering leaders to submit changes to existing or new cloud workloads. This can be an online spreadsheet, right, where they simply model out for the next 12 months, we have X amount of dollars that we are going to have new in the cloud, or we are doing a usage optimization, and that usage optimization results in Y amount of dollars in savings, right? And then the spreadsheet can then be layered into the forecast, right? Either you take the annual number, right, and you divide it by 12, and then you get your monthly numbers. Or if there is, let's say, a marketing campaign, the marketing campaign has a shape, right, where first it ramps up, then it plateaus, and then it goes down again, right? You can actually model that month by month in that spreadsheet, as well as dollar numbers in different cells, right? Another one is to use multiple forecast models, right? And we will go over some of those examples to determine what is the best forecast model for your cloud usage. And this could also change depending on the business unit, right? Some models work better for business unit A, while others work better for business unit B. So have that flexibility, right? And also, you may have to adjust the parameters in the forecasting model to improve your forecast variance. Now, let's take a look at why is cloud spend actually so important, right? So in the pie chart on the left, we see this is a typical spend of an organization. About 50% is spent on headcount. Then some kind of percentage is spent on offices, operations, physical operations, things like physical security, cafeterias, landscaping, those kind of things, right? Sales is also part of these things. And then we have at the bottom that orange slice, that is what is being spent on technology, right? And for the most part, this is how this looks for all the typical organizations, right? Now, when we look on the right-hand side, we see that some portion, and in this case, it is the blue portion, is being spent on cloud, while the orange portion on the right-hand side, the little sliver, is spent on innovation, right? I call it here special projects, but those are kind of moonshot initiatives where an engineer has an idea, they need to run an experiment, and if the experiment is successful, it will bring a competitive advantage to your organization, right? So the challenge here is if you over forecast the blue portion, the cloud spend, right? You have less orange, less for innovation, which means that some innovation projects simply can't get started, right? And you're wasting that ability by over forecasting. If you are under forecasting, so the blue area, you forecasted it smaller, and in 6 or 12 months, you determine that it will actually have to be expanded a little bit, right? That means that the money has to come from the innovation. That means that certain projects that were already in flight have to be frozen, put on ice, and while other projects maybe that you started, right, they cannot complete, and there is wastage because of the money that was already spent. You were not able to use it for anything useful, right? Now, that said, let's take a look at what good forecast variances are. What are some good targets? Well, we have the typical crawl, walk, run maturity. And we see here that for crawl maturity, so you're working with spreadsheets essentially, right? The cloud spend is relatively small, maybe in the tens of millions, not in the hundreds of millions. A 20% forecast variance is acceptable for a crawl maturity, right? While for a walk maturity, using some automation, right? You are layering in changes to existing workloads and new workloads and usage optimizations. The forecast variance typically should be around 15%, while at the run maturity, it's mostly automated. The forecast variance should be around 12%. Now, let's do a little bit of math. I promise it's not going to be like super difficult, right? When you forecast, you can use multiple algorithms, right? For example, here is exponential smoothing when there's no trend or no seasonality, right? And in this formula, this is actually fairly simple, right? Your forecast is here F for the month of T, right? And then you have your actuals from the last month. Of course, for the current month, you don't have actuals yet, so you can't even use that. So you see here T-1, that's the forecast that's the actuals for the previous month. And then you have the forecast for the previous month, right? This is, and if you don't have a forecast, just use actuals here. And then you have alpha. Alpha is simply a smoothing constant, right? If you don't know what you should use, just use 50% on both sides, right? You have here, let's say if alpha is 20%, then your actuals have less impact, which means that if your actuals are very noisy, very spiky, they go up and down, right? Having alpha less than 50% will smooth this out a little bit. This is why it's called a smoothing constant. And then you have here 1 minus alpha, right? That's the opposite, so that's 80% in this case, right? So you give much more weight to the previous month's forecast, right? If you want to do the opposite, you make alpha 80%, right? And so you want to follow the actuals more closely, and then your forecast is actually being downgraded and has less impact on this formula, right? Now, that is a very simple system. Again, it is for no trend and no seasonality. Now, you can use Holt's Winter's exponential smoothing if there is trend and seasonality, right? Again, we are going to walk through this. It's not that complicated. Your forecast is basically the sum of your level and your trend. Those are the two things that are being introduced here. And your level is basically your actuals, again with a smoothing constant, and then the previous month level and trend. You just sum those up, apply the smoothing constant, and that gives you the level, right? For your trend, you get the current and the previous month trend, and you level, and you add the previous month trend to it, right? And again, you have a smoothing constant to give a higher weight depending what you want to do. If you don't know what to use for alpha and beta, you just use 0.5 and that will be fine. Again, this will give you a forecast for when there is a trend or a seasonality. For example, for Intuit tax day, right? There is definitely seasonal impact. Now let's look at a couple of forecasting systems. Here is a driver-based forecasting system for Amazon Web Services, or AWS. And you see here, I will just walk us through it. It's again, not very complicated. You have your curve file here, your cost and usage report, right? You use Athena to pull that cost and usage report out of a Parquet format, and you use a batch processing system, so you can use AWS Glue or anything else. In our case, we use Airflow, Apache Airflow, right? Now, we have all these things like rate optimizations, right? Usage optimizations and workload changes, right? The things that in a walk maturity, in a crawl maturity, we would capture that in a spreadsheet. In this specific case, right, we wanted to automate that a little bit more. So we capture all of these things, and including any business KPIs, in a little MySQL relational database. For example, we map workloads using tags to business KPIs. That entire table is only 3,800 rows, right? Where we know, oh, does this workload grow with streaming hours? Does this workload grow with active accounts? Does this workload grow with ad revenue, right? You have a simple mapping table, and then you use different algorithms on that mapping table. And thankfully, at Roku, even like VPs and directors, they know how to use a SQL client, right? So they directly connect to this database, and then you can add these tables just like you would add spreadsheets, online spreadsheets, right? Now, the batch processing then makes this data available in an online analytical database that happens to be Redshift, is really fast. And then we use Looker dashboards for pre-made reports, right? Or canned reports. There's quite a few of them, something like, close to 40, that show different aspects, including reports that go into Kubernetes, and those kind of things, and do forecasts based on that, right? At the same time, we also move the same data in Apache Hive, where it is being made available for queries using Apache Superset, right? Superset allows for ad hoc HiveQL queries. So if you know SQL or SQL, you can build your own reports. You don't have to fully rely on these canned reports, right? Now let's look at a forecasting system for Azure. Here, the same principle applies, right? We have a little FinOps database here, and we use Azure functions to interact with this little FinOps database. And on the Azure side, we have a different thing that we can take advantage of. We can actually have data in online spreadsheets and then use Power BI to scrape the data out of those spreadsheets. So this is where we get new workloads, changes to existing workloads, usage optimizations, and all those things can be safely stored in spreadsheets, and then Power BI just accesses the data from the spreadsheets, and then we use Logic App to provide this information on a regular basis, and from here we can do email alerting or any other kind of that is required, right, for waste reduction, usage optimization, rate optimizations, right, and for forecasting. Now, let's take a look at fully allocating of cloud spend. What are the typical challenges? Well, you don't know who the owners are of your cloud cost, right? And we're going to talk about how to overcome them in just a moment. And then you have either untaggable cloud resources, such as data transfer charges, or you have untagged resources. Basically, people were missing tags, right? They initiated workloads in the cloud and forgot to assign tags to them, right? To overcome these, simply, follow the steps outlined here. Build a tagging policy. I suggest fewer mandatory tags work better than many mandatory tags, right? At Roku, we only use 2 tags. It's sort of like the team and the application, right? You can think of them that way. And that helps us to uniquely identify the engineer that is responsible for this workload, right? And it's important for accountability as well. And track missing and incorrect tags, right? You can have a percentage, for example, report on a monthly basis. What is the percentage of missing or incorrect tags, and you just track that over time. Of course, you want to be trending down, right, as people improve. And as I mentioned before, we have a little database that has 3,800 rows in it, about where we map these tags to the business, right? To KPIs, actually, right? So we know that this workload grows with this KPI. So if you forecast the KPI, let's say streaming hours or ad revenue or something like that, active accounts, right? We know what the growth of that KPI over time is, and we can then apply that growth to that workload, right? For start, if you have a lot of untagged resources, start with other category, right? Ideally, the other category should be relatively small, but I have seen some organizations, the other category can be starting at like 60%, right? That's fine. Take it from there and then just try to optimize it over time, right? Whenever you have untaggable or shared resources, like in a Kubernetes cluster, right, where the cost of the control plane has to be apportioned to the individual teams that are running containers on that Kubernetes cluster, right? That apportioning strategy has to be well documented, well communicated, And it may also evolve over time, right? A simple apportioning strategy is actually to put in other category. That is already an apportioning strategy, right? And then as you progress over time and the other category shrinks, maybe once it gets to like 15% and lower, right? You may want to get rid of it, and you may have to change your apportioning strategy and communicate it, right? There shouldn't be surprises that a technical owner comes to you and says like, what's happening here, right? They have to be aware of what is going on. Now, let's take a look at enabling automation. Here, specifically for automation, it means that you establish schedules for cloud workloads, right? Because if you are a business or an organization that only works from, let's say, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m., right? The time outside of business hours and on the weekends can result in substantial savings, right? 60% and up, actually, instead of having that thing just running 24/7, right? So what are the typical challenges here? Well, one is that you may have schedules that are kind of complex, right? For example, if you have multiple teams using the follow the sun model, so that you switch maybe from America to Europe and then to Asia Pacific, right? And so the schedule could be quite complicated and maybe even not allow for a schedule at all, right? Stateful workloads, that this workload cannot be simply turned off. You have to issue specific commands to capture the state before you turn off the workload, right? And then there you have monitoring and alerting systems, things like PagerDuty, right? They have to be integrated with those cloud schedules, because if you turn the workload off, it looks to the monitoring system as if the workload is failed. It's down, right? And you don't want engineers to be paged for unnecessarily, right? And so also adoption is another issue, right? Where people just are saying, well, it doesn't come really out of my wallet if this thing is running 24/7. So why should I be worried about that? Now, let's look at how to overcome these challenges, right? You will need either internal or third-party tooling to turn workloads on and back off and back on in the morning, right? This doesn't happen by itself. Yes, you can run some simple scripts, right? But now imagine you want to scale that from a dozen workloads to several hundred workloads, right? You will need some tooling to help you with that. And the tooling will also need to integrate with change management and monitoring so that you don't get false alarms, right? Ideally, you want to build a self-service dashboard that shows the current status of a workload. Is it in hibernation mode or is it in active mode, right? And it's also useful to have the ability to overwrite the current status. For example, if an engineer works late, right? They want to extend the schedule a little bit, right? So that they can keep working. Again, document this very well, socialize it around the organization so that everyone is aware of this automation and there is no surprises where people come and say like, hey, my workload is down, what happened, right? Now, let's look at container cost reporting. What are the typical challenges here? Well, there is the fine-grained cost attribution. Things like data transfer charges at the container level, right? And how to attribute shared resources. So a control plane cost, for example, or you have a multi-tenancy cluster where multiple teams are running on the same cluster, and how to attribute the cost in those cases. Now let's take a look how to overcome that. Well, in a container environment, you use either labels or namespaces instead of tags. Both can be used and both are very effective, right? Again, you will need either internal or third-party tooling to retrieve the mapping of the cost from the container system. And that tooling will have to go into each container system. So let's say you have 200 Kubernetes clusters. In a sense, you now have 200 billing files, right? That you need to retrieve and then aggregate to be able to allocate out that cost, right? And again, if there is some cost that you don't know how to attribute, get started with an others category, right? And then over time, try to shrink that others category as much as possible, right? Any apportioning strategy that you use has to be well documented and well socialized around the organization to avoid surprises, right? You don't want someone to come up to your desk and say, hey, why is my container so expensive? I only use one CPU and 1 GB of memory. I did the calculation on a yellow sticky and I should be paying X amount and you're charging me Y amount, right? You should never be in a situation like that. They need to understand that things like the control plane, the horizontal port auto-scaling, overhead, and these kind of things, they need to be apportioned somehow. Now, finally, we are at the 10th or the last challenge, which is leadership buy-in of cloud FinOps. And as you see, I have 2 slides here because this is a common problem and a complex problem, right? First of all, what are all the challenges that could happen? This is what we're looking here at the slide, right? Leadership could simply not be aware that there is such a thing as cloud FinOps, or that there is a need for continuously go and look at cost optimization in the cloud, right? They simply, they were told maybe, oh, the cloud is cheaper or something like this than the data center, so that solved the problem for them, right? And another more specific one is that leadership may look at cost as a technical issue rather than a strategic business concern, right? When you remember the pie chart that we had under forecasting, right? The cloud cost is a relatively small sliver compared to the entire expenditures, right? And so they may see that as, oh, you know what, we are only spending like 10 million or 20 million on cloud right now. It's something that we don't have to worry about, right? There also may be resistance to change, right? That fundamentally, when you go from a data center to the cloud, there is a shift in procurement, right? You're in the data center, you have a very strict procurement process, while in the cloud, an engineer can just initiate a workload that is tens of thousands of dollars a day, and leadership may not be aware of that and be resistant to adopting a different procurement model in their mind's eye, right? There is the next point shows that as well, right? There is a fear of loss of control because the authority to make purchases is now with the engineers. And it used to be a very strict process where finance has to sign up. There's a budget. The purchase order is being made for the hardware. The hardware has to be built and shipped, and then it will be installed. And that can be a problem as well, right? And then leadership may not be supportive because they don't see any evidence that there is cost savings or business benefits, right? Before they agree to do something. They simply, there's no history, right? So you come and say like, hey, I can save us, X amount of dollars. And they say like, well, but what evidence do you have? Do you have any historic, cases that you can cite, right? And lastly, there is also that FinOps needs to be aligned with business goals, right? One example is, let's say you are at one organization that is extremely cash heavy, and that organization may want to do all upfront purchases of commitments in the cloud, right? While another organization is maybe very technology heavy, where any excess cash can be used for innovation, right? And that innovation can directly impact revenue. In that case, making no upfront purchases of commitments is preferred, right? So you need that alignment with business goals. Now let's take a look at how to overcome the leadership buy-in of cloud FinOps challenges, right? One is that I mentioned in the very beginning that you have a business cadence that you set up, right? And during that business cadence, it's typically it follows the same pattern over and over, where you look at what have we accomplished since the last meeting, what are our goals for the next meeting, and is there anything that leadership can help with, any roadblocks, any showstoppers that they can help with, right? And again, there may also be an educational aspect to leadership, right? That a CTO that was very successful in the data center for a decade has to change what they are doing, and their mindset has to change to be able to adopt to the elasticity model of the cloud, right? One thing that I also noticed is that if you ask leadership to make a decision for you, in that case, you need to offer multiple options. I mean, at least two, right? If you only offer one option and that's all they can do, they don't have much of a choice, right? But if there's multiple options, especially high-level leadership feels really comfortable of making a decision, and then because they made that decision, they will support that decision, right? It becomes theirs. It's sort of like, a mental advantage that you can get there, right? And when you present those options for the decision, make mini business cases, right? Have like, hey, this is the effort that we estimated, this is the outcome, this is the situation that we are trying to solve, and this is the successful outcome that we are expecting, right? That is a mini business case. And any successful outcomes, socialize that, I mean, definitely with executives, but also with leadership around the organization. The most powerful thing here that you can do is that the executives take one or two of your FinOps slides and include that in their deck as when they are communicating with their leadership, and showcase your successful outcomes across the leadership team without you even being present in that meeting. That is a very powerful thing to do, right? And again, you need to foster a culture of accountability. If someone makes a mistake, that's fine, right? To be able to fail quickly, you need to move quickly, right? If you move slowly, then you can only fail slowly. So if someone made a mistake, that's fine. Let's learn from it. Let's continue, right? If direct interaction with leadership is not possible, look for a sponsor, someone that can act as a mediator between you and the executive, someone that the executives trust, right? That person has been with the company for a very long time, and you engage with that person instead, and they become your spokesperson when it comes to interacting with leadership, right? Another option that you have is that you can leverage external resources when it comes to leadership education, training, and a culture shift where cost becomes one of the dimensions that we want to optimize in the cloud, right? And so you can use, for example, Gartner or any other consulting agency that is an option in your organization. And if all else fails, right, you can simply do whatever you can do, right, and wait for a CFO intervention. That is typically, on that slide where I showed 5 years, right, and our cloud cost was doubling year over year for 3 consecutive years, right? At some point, the CFO will come and say, like, yeah, we can't do this, right? The cloud is growing faster than revenue. So that's a problem, right? So if all else fails, you do whatever you can, right? Maybe with rate optimization and some usage optimization, right? Until that intervention happens where one executive says like, okay, this is unsustainable. We need to go and and do something else here, right? And then, of course, you're there as the FinOps person, and you can help them to improve and to remediate. Okay, in this presentation, we referenced a whole bunch of material from the FinOps Foundation. So here are the references. Anything that I used, you guys can find on that slide. And at this point, we're coming to an end. Thank you so much for being here. And if you have any questions or you need to reach out to me, you can do so. My contact information is on the slide. Thanks again for watching, and hope you guys have a great day. Take care. Bye.